Okay, my wife wants me to build another tomato trellis for her. This was put in last year. So the tomatoes go on each side and they climb up. It's made of copper and it's aged a bit, but we'll build a new one today for the other planter. So all I do is I measure the width of the planter. It's 4 feet wide, and I'm gonna use a 3/4 inch copper pipe to do it. So it's nice and sturdy and it looks good. So I will give the dimensions for all these, each fitting and each length in a summary, but I'm basically doing the width. I figured out my height, total height here is 63 inches, and that'll be high enough for our tomatoes to climb up. This is also copper wire. Okay, so my planter is 4 feet wide on the inside. So I'm gonna make this 4 feet wide on the outside. And that means that I've got a 3/4 inch elbow on each corner. In this pipe section, I bought a 10-foot section of 3/4 inch pipe, and you just cut it down simply with a hacksaw, and I'll show you that in a second. But this top piece is going to be 47 inches, and it goes inside the pipe. So this piece in itself is 47 inches. You just clean these off, and I'll show you how to do that. Fit them inside each pipe. And it'll be ready to solder in a little bit. So the cross pieces, the top and the bottom, are 47 inches. This long piece, which will be upright, is 54.5. So the leg is 8.5 inches, and I'm measuring from the end right up until that little knuckle. Again, this is a 3/4 inch T. So 8.5 inches. This section is 47 inches from knuckle to little knuckle. And the two sections here are 54.5 on each side. So now I've got this laid out. I'm gonna solder it up. That will only take a few minutes, and then we'll be ready to assemble it in the garden. So when you solder, it's easy to do. You just take some of this solder goop. You take some sandpaper and you clean up the inside of this joint to make it shiny. So I just take some sandpaper and clean up the inside, just like this. Make sure it's good and shiny on each of these. This is a T, 3/4 inch. All right, and you wipe this solder gel inside that keeps the solder clean and keeps it flowing. And you wipe it on the outside of this pipe. Then you stick them together. And I'll do that for all the other fittings. So the last measurement that I needed, so I've created the top section, a bottom section to keep everything stiff, and a short leg section. So I just measured that out. This total length for my application is going to be 65 inches. Doesn't much matter for yours, but all I'm going to do, make my mark, and you can just take a hacksaw or a pipe cutter, score it, and saw it up. And copper cuts really easy, so it just takes a second. So my final assembly, putting a little bit more solder flux on, that's what it's called, flux. This is about $2, it's cheap. Do the final fitting. I'll do the same on the other side, and then I will be ready to solder, which I will show everybody how to do. All right, so now I'm ready to solder. I have some silver solder. I have just a tank of propane and a benzomatic little trigger for my flame. And I put the wood down because if you solder on concrete, sometimes it can pop if there's any moisture in it. Obviously wear some safety glasses, but soldering is easy. You basically, what you need to do is you need to heat up this joint, and once you get it warm, again, the flux is in there already, so it's all clean. You heat that joint up. As soon as it gets hot and you touch the solder is gonna flow in there. And you don't need it, obviously, watertight. It just makes it rock solid when the solder flows. You can see it starting to warm up. The flux melts. All right, so the first joint is done. Do not touch it because it'll be warm. This one is still fairly warm, so I'll just hit the torch on it. This will be all locked up with silver solder and will be very stiff when we're done. You can see the solder just flowing in. And that's all you need. Okay, so I'm gonna just keep soldering each joint all the way around, doing the same thing. All right, so final joint. If you find that, just pull the solder out so you don't have to get too close to your torch. But if you find that the solder is not flowing, you just need to heat that joint up a little bit more and the solder will start to flow in. Now it's getting hot. I can see my flux melting. Now the solder's starting to melt. Now it's flowing. So I would probably not use as dry a piece of wood as I used. It still works, but if you wet that wood down, it's gonna help. Doesn't affect me, I've done this before, but last year when I did it right on the concrete, I had one pop of the concrete because it got so hot. So that just an FYI, you definitely don't wanna do that, and you do wanna wear some safety glasses. So here we go in our last fitting. See it flowing, and it just comes off this stick. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to measure in. It's 17 inches. So I'm placing it in this upright planter, 17 inches in. So I'll dig away some dirt and get ready to position it. So the way I actually designed this You actually have to dig out the middle a little bit, and you'll see why in a second. So I've got everything positioned. I measured the height on the old one so they're symmetrical, because I hate when things aren't. 53.5 inches exposed. So this pipe ends up sitting, the bottom pipe ends up sitting below the ground. But I need it to run the copper wire for the tomatoes to climb up. So you'll see how we do that in a second. Okay, so now what I'm gonna do is take some copper tube strap, 4 of these, and attach this to the elevated garden. So I've checked to make sure that this is level with the level. And now all I'm gonna do is mount the copper strap, round the pipe, screw it in on the top and the bottom, and then we go on to our next step. Okay, so now what I have to do is string copper wire across for the tomatoes or peas or whatever to climb up. So I've got, you can get this bare copper wire at Home Depot. It's about 60 cents a foot. It's not cheap. They do have a thinner one, but I like the look of the heavier. And this obviously isn't the cheapest trellis to make, but it looks good. So for a 47-inch width, I took a 5-foot length on my tape measure and just measured out wire and cut it. So I've got these gapped, if you like the look of this gap. These are about 8 inches. And I string them all up and then adjust them a little bit, interweave them. But each of these squares are big enough that you can reach through, guide the tomatoes or peas up through, or reach around if you're harvesting. So to bend the copper around, I've got a wire cutter. Put it up, give it a good wrap. We're going to solder these later, so this is just to get it nice and taut. Now I've got these all strung out. They're 7-inch gaps, so I'm going to do the horizontal first. Put your flux in that joint, and I just wrap the wire around, kind of pulled it taut, so these are fairly taut, and I'm just going to heat up and solder each of these in place. You don't need a lot, that'll be good. And I'll do that for each one of them. This is how the joint looks when you're done. Now you can see the height of the new one is all lined up with the other, so I'll sleep well at night knowing that they're symmetrical. But now all I have to do is the vertical wires and I'll be finished. Okay. When I do the copper wire vertically, I actually weave it on one side then the other and alternate between. It creates a little bit of tension, and then I'm going to spot solder each one of these in place. On the vertical pieces, just going to put your flex on each one of these areas, and then eventually on this joint to lock them in place. So when you wrap the copper wire around, this pipe, you can grab it with the pliers, give it a pull to create a little bit of tension on the wire.